about your virtue, which is a great virtue and it's hard to name. So you say, "This is my good. This I love. It pleases me wholly. Thus alone do I want the good. I do not want it as divine law. I do not want it as human statute and need. It shall not be a signpost for me to over earths and paradises, other worlds. It is an earthly virtue that I love. In the end, all your passions became virtues, and all your devils, angels. Once you had wild dogs in your cellar, but in the end they turned into birds and lovely singers. Out of your poisons you brewed your balsam. You milked your cow, melancholy. Now you drink the sweet milk of her udder. I think Nietzsche didn't rewrite this, or else very large parts of it were unwritten, and I think he wrote this just in a couple or a few weeks, if I remember correctly. So some things like that, he must have had something on his mind while he was going. And nothing evil grows out of you henceforth, unless it be the evil that grows out of the fight among your virtues. My brother, if you are fortunate, you have... Pause for a second there. Imagine an objectivist saying, I became evil because my virtues were fighting amongst themselves. I had one virtue of reason, and another virtue of honesty, and another virtue of integrity, and another virtue of farsightedness, and another virtue of productivity, and they were clashing, so I started robbing people.
Well, yes. It's not that you would start robbing people, per se. You know, it's not just randomly you lose your virtues. It's the fact that you're going to have to choose which virtue to follow. So, for example, let's say, you know, you have a virtue of that you provide for your family, and you have another virtue that you don't steal. But you're thrown into a situation, let's say a natural disaster, where you have to acquire food, say from an empty grocery store or from an abandoned house. And this to you feels like stealing, and is stealing by your definition, though maybe the conditions allow you to change it, and that's exactly it. You might have to adjust your virtues to bring them back aligned when faced with a dire situation that maybe isn't the ordinary situation that you're already used to handling. And so that's more the idea, is that you know, it can be a virtue to be aggressive and defend justice, you know, for example, to fight Hitler. It can also be a virtue to be compassionate and try diplomacy one more time, and you have to decide case by case which of these virtues to follow, and they do come into conflict, and that's the kind of thing he's talking about. It's not that you have so much virtue you just give up on them all. It's that you can't follow two of them all the way to their conclusion sometimes.
And many have gone into the desert and taken their lives because they had wearied of being the battle and battlefield of virtues. It's bizarre. I mean, what the hell does he mean by virtue? My brother, are war and battle evil? But this evil is necessary. Necessary are the envy and mistrust and calumny among your virtues. Each virtue is jealous of the others, and jealousy is a terrible thing. Virtues, too, can perish of jealousy. Surrounded by the flame of jealousy, one will, in the end, like the scorpion, turn one's poisonous sting against oneself. Alas, my brother, have you never yet seen a virtue deny and stab herself? And I would need an example of that, I think. Man is something that must be overcome, and therefore you shall love your virtues, for you will perish of them. I suppose if we interpret virtues as not virtuous, if we're talking really about vices here, then he might be correct. Your vices do fight amongst themselves. You have one vice of doing heroin every day, and you have another vice of robbing people to pay for heroin. So which one do I want to do today? If I go out and do some robberies, then I'll have more money for heroin. But if I just sit here and do the heroin I have, what the hell, I'll just do this heroin, then when they're desperate they go out and rob more, and you've got to have your virtues of fighting and destroying you. That's the only thing I could see, is that if you call them virtues that are actually vices. I can't understand it otherwise.
Well, that's the thing I've been trying to describe to you, but just use your example of vices. Okay, so the guy wants to steal and he also wants some heroin. Well, what if one of your virtues is that you exercise, and another virtue of yours is that you are well-read? You still have to decide which they do. See? And that's what he's saying, is that both of those virtues kind of want the whole person to have you, exercising all the time, reading all the time. So it is, in fact, from the so-called battle that you get balance. Of course, it doesn't have to be a battle. It can be a conversation of some sort. But I think still Nietzsche would be characterizing that as a struggle. Right?
You couldn't understand productivity fighting against honesty, reason, and integrity inside of your person. Honesty doesn't want to battle above the virtue of productivity.
Oh, MrCropper, I found this interesting. Forgive me if I psychoanalyze, and I'll admit right now I might be projecting some of this in, but these are interesting examples, honesty versus productivity. There's a big contrast there. But I see you segue in almost as though maybe you glimpse some conflict there, and then you segue into a comparison between honesty and, misspeak honesty, no, but honesty and integrity.
Or the virtue of integrity. You want to be more honest than you want to have integrity, and I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
See, integrity is closely related to honesty, so that's a bit more muddy waters. Now, I think I can set up conflicts even in those two, but a much clearer example is this first one you just said of productivity versus honesty. Now, an important thing is to not mistake the ability to negotiate and resolve a conflict with the state of there not being a conflict in the first place. So, for example, imagine a community. There's a thought experiment. Hypothetically, it's got a justice system, and it solves 100% of the conflicts that come to that justice system satisfactorily to the parties involved, 100% of the time, even if you did have a system like that. Well, it'd be very different if there were no cases before them and they never had any conflict than the state I've just described, where they have the conflict and resolve it. So not having a conflict arise in the first place is different from being able to reliably resolve that conflict. Now, in an objectivist framework, of course, you are going to want to believe that a virtue is a virtue, and it can never lead to a non-virtuous end or conflict with other virtues, either one. So you maybe want to avoid something where, I think you could probably see the conflicts between productivity and honesty. Take an industrialist like George Hearst. I think a fair Randian character, in the sense it's the kind of industrialist that Rand tended to admire. Not only did he have a sense of about mining, like that it ran in his blood, but he also had this urge always to improve his techniques, and he improved the methods for getting ore out of quartz. Productivity as a virtue he had in great abundance, but honesty not so much. For example, let's say you run a hypothetical example. You run a factory of 60 person making thingamajigs, but one of the components is out. You're out of widgets. And somebody comes along, it's like, no, I got some widgets. They fell off the back of a truck. Well, your honesty and your productivity are in conflict.
Unless he's saying to these people in a patronizing way, la la la, your virtues, your virtues, your virtues, and actually he's meaning your vices.